Hello again, ladies and gentlemen. Michael Matt for the Remnant Forum. If you're in your 40s, as I am, you can probably still remember when thriving orders of Catholic nuns were running so much of the world in which we lived back then in the good old days. Our schools, hospitals, orphanages, soup kitchens, cloistered religious houses, and missions all over the world were run by Catholic nuns. Everywhere, in the streets, the schools, churches, bus stations, airports, you name it, Catholic nuns in habits were omnipresent. Even Hollywood movies about crashing airplanes or burning buildings or sinking ships more often than not included Catholic nuns. Well, by the time I came along, I guess they were strumming guitars and singing folk songs, but you get the idea. The old nuns were a constant and familiar presence in modern life to such an extent that the movies and even TV were filled with them. Audrey Hepburn played arguably the most beautiful nun in the history of the world, and Sally Fields kept America laughing as the flying nun just a few years ago when I was a boy. So what happened? Well, there's all sorts of explanations for that, but they include a modernist revolution and takeover of the Catholic Church. But even that short time ago, I wonder if anyone, any of us, ever imagined that in just a few short years, those beautiful Catholic women would disappear almost entirely from the face of the earth. And those old school buildings would be shuttered, bulldozed, and sold off to Muslim groups in our lifetimes. But you know what's really frightening? And that is that unless something dramatic alters the course we're presently on, in another 30 years, Catholic priests will have gone the same way as Catholic nuns. Now let's think about that for a moment. What will that mean for us? What will it mean for our children? The world has become, as we all know, a cesspool of paganism, with pornography, deviancy, and perversion now omnipresent and mainstream in our culture. Purity is rare, virginity is a joke, and the struggle to live chaste lives, especially for our young people, has become an almost heroic endeavor. And as the average age of priests rises, and with scandal and homosexuality in the priesthood so rampant now that many young men are turned off by the very idea of a vocation to the priesthood, a world is coming very soon where sin will be difficult to avoid, priests and thus confession scarce, and yet the persecution of Christians on the rise. You'll go over to that neighborhood church on a Saturday afternoon, for example, and there will be no priest there. The little green light will be off. A janitor will inform you that maybe next month confession will be offered by some visiting priest from China or somewhere. What then? What is our world going to look like then? Now that's the future that many see. And yet I can't understand why Pope Francis is walking around the eternal city right now with his two thumbs up in the air and that great big smile on his face all the time. What are they so happy about in Rome? Don't they realize that all of this is coming? Don't they understand what we are going through trying to raise children in the modern world? This is not just a tratty thing. It's not some matter of liturgical preference anymore. We're facing persecution and death without priests and the sacrament in the future. Don't you think that it's time that we take a stand, that we let our voices be heard while we still have the opportunity to do so? How far are we willing to go making excuses for what is going on and for holding our peace? How far? Why are we keeping silent? Why are we making those excuses? What is going to be our last straw? Will the upcoming Synod on the Family be the end of all this? Yeah, right. Before these people are through, we will be told that as good Catholics, we must accept homosexual marriage. That's just around the corner. That's what's coming. Are we ready for that? Are we going to keep our silence until that happens? And now we have the extraordinary Jubilee Year of Mercy coming, which begins on December 8th and ends on the 20th of November 2016. And what this means, according to Pope Francis, as he put it just this week, is that we Christians need to stop thinking, quote, like doctors of the law who destroy what the Holy Spirit does in people's hearts. The doors of the church cannot be closed, said Francis, because the church is the Lord's house of mercy, which welcomes everyone. We cannot be Christians who often close the church's door in the face of those who come knocking, says Pope Francis. Chris Ferrara, what in the world is this man talking about? The only church doors that I see closed these days are the hundreds that are locked up, boarded up, or sold off to Protestants and Muslims in the wake of the Second Vatican Council.
Well,
what do you think?
This is a continuing theme of these broadcasts, this delusion that is gripping churchmen today. And I noticed during the introduction, there was a tone of exasperation, if not irritation, in your voice. And it's entirely justified. Even somebody like Father Z has pretty much had enough. Speaking of that sermon you just mentioned that the Pope gave on March 17th, he said, and I'm quoting Father Z's blog, "Who the heck are these doctors of the law whom he has been disparaging with some frequency?" I think he means those who argue that people who are divorced and civilly remarried should not be admitted to Holy Communion because they are objectively living in a state that is inconsistent with our understanding of the Eucharist. That's what he means by doctors of the law, and it's not even thinly veiled at this point. I mean, we get the message. But who are these doctors of the law, Michael? I'll tell you who they are. The doctors of the law include the last two popes. Here's the doctor of the law by the name of John Paul II.
Yeah, that radical traditionalist.
And this was after the 1980 Synod of Bishops. In his encyclical Familiaris Consortio, in which Doctor of the Law, John Paul II, insisted, and I quote, "The Church reaffirms her practice, which is based upon sacred scripture, of not admitting to Eucharistic communion divorced persons who have remarried. They are unable to be admitted thereto from the fact that their state and condition of life objectively contradict that union of love between Christ and the Church, which is signified and effected by the Eucharist. Besides this," said the doctor of the law, whom Francis just happened to have canonized, "there is another special pastoral reason. If these people were admitted to the Eucharist, the faithful would be led into error and confusion regarding the Church's teaching about the indissolubility of marriage." And there's another doctor of law, Pope Benedict XVI, this time after the Synod of 2005, in his apostolic exhortation, Sacramentum Caritatis. And I quote, "The Synod of Bishops confirmed the Church's practice based on sacred scripture," citing Mark 10, verses 2 to 12, "of not admitting the divorced and remarried to the sacraments, since their state and condition of life objectively contradict the loving union of Christ and the Church signified and made present in the Eucharist. Yet the divorced and remarried continue to belong to the Church," which of course nobody denies, "which accompanies them with special concern and encourages them to live as fully as possible the Christian life through regular participation at Mass, albeit without receiving communion." So, these two popes, according to this latest sermon at Casa Santa Marta, would be denounced as doctors of the law who are closing the doors of the Church to these poor Christians who made a mistake. And what was the mistake they made? Someone abandoned his wife, or some woman abandoned her husband, they took up with another man or another woman, or they willingly married someone who was divorced, entering into a union that the Church has to consider to be adultery. I mean, enough, really enough. Now even Father Z is fed up, and his tone is reflected in your tone. When is this demagoguery going to stop?
Yeah, he's not talking about traditionalists, is he, Chris? I mean, some of our critics have said that we're too thin-skinned. We need to stop taking this also personally. You know what? Pope Francis is not talking about us. We're too small. He's talking about the mainstream Catholics who are still left and who still believe you got to follow some rules in order to remain true to the Catholic faith. That's all I can conclude. There's no way he would be giving sermon after sermon about this small group of traditionalist Catholics scattered throughout the world. What do you think? I think he's talking about a much larger group, basically rules-following Catholics, those who are left.
I just told you he's talking about John Paul II and Benedict XVI, his own predecessors, for heaven's sake. They apparently are doctors of the law. But there's something really remarkable about this sermon of his on March 17th. And again, there's a pattern here of the abuse of sacred scripture to advance this Casper agenda. The Casper agenda of admitting divorced and remarried Catholics to the Blessed Sacrament, which of course means the destruction of the entire moral edifice of the Church in short order, because they can be admitted to Holy Communion, living in a state of continual and public adultery. Who can't be? What's next is the demand that cohabiting couples be admitted to Holy Communion, that cohabiting gay couples be admitted to Holy Communion, because after all, they made some mistakes. And who are we to close the doors of the Church?
Sure, that's coming very soon.
But the sermon was based on the gospel account of the lame man at the pool of Bethesda. You remember the gospel account. He's at this pool and he's lame, so he can't walk to the pool. And the angels stir the waters of the pool every so often. And when the waters are being stirred, it's possible to enter the pool and be cured, rather like Lourdes. But the poor lame man can never get to the pool in time because he can't walk and nobody wants to carry him to the pool. And finally, our Lord encounters him and heals him directly because of his faith in the Lord. Somehow, Francis twists this into a denunciation, effectively, of his own predecessors. He sees in the incident at Bethesda Catholics who were closing the doors to the church as if it were the pool of Bethesda, so that these poor people who decided to take up with people who aren't their wives or husbands can receive, apparently, Holy Communion. Here's what he says. And how many times does this person find closed doors within the Christian community? And I'm quoting directly from the video, which I'm translating myself. You can't. No, you can't. You made a mistake and you can't. If you want to come to Sunday Mass, but stay there. And he points over to the back, as he's pointing to the back of the church. But stay there and don't do anything else, or don't do anything more. And what the Holy Spirit has done in the hearts of people, these Christians, with the psychology of doctors of the law, destroy. And then later on he says, even today there are Christians who behave like doctors of the law and do the same thing they did with Jesus, meaning the Pharisees at the pool of Bethesda, who denounced Jesus for effecting this cure of the lame man because it was on the Sabbath. And he goes on to mimic these supposed Christians. This one speaks heresy. This one cannot. This one goes against the discipline of the church. This one goes against the law. And thus they close the doors to so many people. So what he's basically saying is anybody who objects to heresy and violation of church law as a bar to participation in the sacramental life is a doctor of the law, is a Pharisee, including John Paul II and Benedict XVI.
Yeah,
it's unbelievable. There's no end. There seems to be no end to this.
And the problem, as we all know, is a lack of the very target that he's pulling out of thin air and creating. I mean, where are all these priests who are thundering from the pulpit, that you must follow the rules, that you must go to confession, that you must not come to communion in the state of mortal sin? Where are they? So what is he talking about? I mean, he's addressing an issue that obviously doesn't exist, at least not in a very significant way. So he's talking about something else. And I think what he's talking about, as you said earlier, is just simply the teaching of the church. So what do we do now with a pope who's apparently trying to scare people away from faithful adherence to the laws of the church? What do we do with this person? What happens to souls? What happens to young people? What happens to the families because of the scandal now being dished up by the successor of St. Peter?
I don't think there's any time or any need to sugarcoat what we have to do. We have to do what was done at the time of John the 22nd when he was preaching heresy from the pulpit about the beatific vision and the particular judgment. We have to stand up and denounce what is being said as wrong, as scandalous, as confusing to the faithful, as unfaithful even to the teaching of his immediate two predecessors. We have to denounce it, and we have to use the means that have been made available to us through the internet, through shows like this. I mean, who are we? We're just lay people. We have access to these means of communication. Anybody can do this if he has the will. And if we're speaking the truth, we have the right to proclaim that truth to others through the means of the internet. The Code of Canon Law, specifically Canon 212, guarantees our right to do this. So we have to stand up and join people like Father Z and other bloggers on the internet and ask this question that Father Z asks. Who the heck is the Pope talking about? Who are these doctors of the law? And what's ironic here, Mike, is that we hear all this talk about doctors of the law, the cruel people who want to enforce the church's discipline against these poor people who decided they wanted a second or third spouse. And yet when it comes to the Society of St. Pius X, all of a sudden, the doctors of the law are quite acceptable. Yeah. And the law has to be followed strictly. We just saw a column today at Crux magazine by John Allen to the effect that the 1 million members of the Society of St. Pius X are cluck, cluck, wag the finger in a state of schism, and they're just a footnote in history. Too bad these poor schismatics are just a footnote in history. To even suggest that people of this kind, Catholics who adhere to every doctrine and dogma of the faith, are schismatic in this climate, with the Pope denouncing faithful Catholics as doctors of the law, it's just laughable. We're in Wonderland.
It's laughable and unfortunate. I mean, right now, I know it would be one thing if the Society of St. Pius X were thundering against Francis every day, but for whatever reason, at the moment, they're not. I mean, they're basically talking more often than not about, reopening negotiations with the Vatican and so forth. So they're not out there showing up the John Allens of the world by their criticisms of Francis, and yet still they're being attacked by him, which to me says it's their adherence to the laws of the Church that bothers these people. There's strict adherence as Catholics to the rules that all of our fathers and grandfathers back to the beginning followed. And that's a very dangerous, I think, time period in which we live, in which just simple adherence to the rules of the Church will earn you attacks from the Pope all the way down to high-ranking members of the Catholic media. Yet that's, I think, precisely where we are. Don't follow the rules. Don't be so rigorous. It's not necessary anymore, which to me seems pretty darn demonic, Chris.
Well, don't follow the rules. Don't be a rigorist. It isn't necessary anymore, except when it comes to the Society of St. Pius X. And then a rigorous adherence to the rules is mandatory. Why, those bishops back in 1988 were canonized, or rather consecrated, without following the dictates of canon law. They didn't receive the papal approval beforehand, so they're excommunicated. And even when the excommunication is lifted, well, technically they have an irregular status and they don't have a canonical mission, even though they're Catholics, even though they're not excommunicated, and they can receive the sacraments like everybody else. What do we do with these people? Why, we do what Francis says. We close the doors of the Church. We kick them out. We denounce them. We marginalize them. These good people who follow the teachings of the Church. What hypocrisy!
Yeah.
I mean, my voice is rising. I'm sure I seem to be quite angry as I'm saying these things. But like Father Z, I've had enough. I've had enough. You know what, Mike? Give us back our religion.
Yeah, exactly.
That should be the theme of these discussions that Catholics are having amongst themselves. Give us back the religion that our parents taught us, that their parents taught them, back for 100 generations. Enough of this nonsense about rigorism applied to nobody except faithful Catholics, while the Church is falling to pieces everywhere else. Enough of this obfuscation about a mission that doesn't involve proselytizing, or evangelization that doesn't involve evangelizing, or a liturgical renewal that involves the absolute destruction of the liturgy, or a springtime that is a winter for the Church, like no other perhaps since the Arian crisis of the 4th century. Stop the slogan, stop the obfuscation, give us back the catechism, the 4 last things, and the advice, the sound advice that we received as children, and our parents received as children, going back to when the memory of man runs not to the contrary.
Yeah, absolutely. I started this broadcast by talking about, what I remember from Catholic school. So in other words, I'm in my 40s, so just 35, 40 years ago, this is what we were being taught by the Catholic Church. We're not talking about some ancient, let's go back to what Charlemagne was being taught when he was in his, growing up stage. We're talking about recent living memory of what the Catholic Church was teaching. But Chris, I want to shift gears just for a second because, I don't know if you're following this story about this Navy, 20-year veteran Navy chaplain who recently got himself in a bunch of trouble. Now they're basically throwing him out of the Navy for having adhered to the Church's teaching, supposedly in private advice sessions on premarital sex and homosexuality. Well, it turns out that he was actually busted. He was set up by, you guessed it, a married, practicing, faithful Catholic seaman. So that's where the story stands right now. But you look at this man waging his war in order to simply preach and teach and give advice based on Christian moral theology. Now, he's a Protestant, and you can see him getting prepared. I'm sure he's going to lose this war. He will be thrown out of the Navy for this. So you see persecution coming at every level. And what I wanted to ask you about is, everybody, lots of our critics are constantly sort of haranguing that, well, this is just tratty nitpicking and tratty paranoia and all of this. I mean, what we're really talking about, Chris, is the rise of persecution throughout the whole world against Christianity. Everybody's talking about that now. And there is one force on earth that can stop that persecution, that can do something about the Christophobia that is now becoming bloody, and that force is the Catholic Church. We don't enjoy sitting here criticizing Pope Francis. We certainly would prefer to have a staunch and a Pope that's up there leading the charge, another Pius V, so that we could just jump behind like we tried to do with Pope Benedict and begin to lead some kind of a charge in defense against those who hate everything we believe. But this really is more than just a traditionalist issue. We are talking about civil liberties eroding and persecution coming if the Catholic Church doesn't get her act together, and soon.
Well, we talked in the last episode about Archbishop Cordileone how he's under attack
Yeah.
by the dictatorship of relativism in San Francisco and under investigation by the California legislature. There's a threat of litigation. Why? Oh, because apparently he's one of those doctors of the law who thinks that Catholic teachers in Catholic schools should actually uphold Catholic morality. And so the persecution you're talking about, Mike, it's now occurring within the Catholic Church. There's an internal persecution of faithful Catholics going on. And I have to say, it's being contributed to by so-called conservative Catholics, among which is Mr. Keating, who has endless amounts of time to denounce traditionalists and make fun of geocentrists. And he, like Mr. John Allen, surveys universal apostasy throughout Europe, massive disobedience to the most fundamental teachings of the faith, de facto schism on the part of hundreds of millions of Catholics who are not submitting to the Roman Pontiff, and the refusal to submit to the Roman Pontiff is the very definition of schism. They reject any papal teaching they don't like. And instead we get articles about the 1 million traditionalists being a footnote and they're in schism, and we have Mr. Keating denouncing the geocentrists and writing a new book about the crackpot traditionalists. And so we have this Southern Poverty Law Center style operation going on within the church, being contributed to not only by the John Allens, but by so-called conservative Catholics. This is simply unacceptable. And we have to stand up and say, stop, give us back the religion that you took away from us. Recognize that faithful Catholics are not doctors of the law. They are simply what Catholics ought to be.
Yeah, Chris, I'm really glad that you brought up Father Zulsdorf, who really has been a fellow traveler in many ways and an old friend. He's not a traditionalist like the remnant is, but I really do believe the times are so bad right now that we need to start looking around and trying to form a larger coalition without phony ecumenism. I just had kind of an unsettling experience when we were down in Mexico together, you and I, and we did an interview of Father Jonathan Romanowski, and Father Romanowski, comes out there, two-fisted priest. He talks about the fact that he gets on the radio and down in Mexico, speaks against the Freemasons, speaks in favor of Christ the King, speaks against gay marriage and so forth, all these great things. He even slid in a little reference where he said, we're waiting for the Society of St. Pius X situation to be resolved. They're in the church. They're not in schism. I mean, all these great things, Chris, that he said, that Father Romanowski said, and then a number of our hardcore, our folks, our good people, I'm not trying to be critical, I'm trying to encourage coming together, but they took umbrage at that. They said, well, the Fraternity of St. Peter is not on our side. They betrayed Archbishop Lefebvre. They're not the Society of St. Pius X. They don't do enough to criticize the new Mass in Vatican II. And I wonder if I could, everybody has been seeing my comments back and forth on Remnant TV and on our comm boxes, but I want to hear something from you on that. In other words, we need to understand who our friends are and who our enemies are. Just like the neo-Catholics have been attacking traditionalists, I think we need to declare a truce on attacking the fraternity or the society, which are just a tiny, tiny little bit different from where we are. And when you get far enough over to the left, we all need to be silenced permanently, according to the left.
I tell you, what we're witnessing now in the church and during this pontificate is the triumph of a paraconciliar ideology, to quote Monsignor Pozzo. It's an ideological war being conducted against Catholics, or not just traditionalists, but anybody who wants to follow the traditional teaching of the Church. And once again, even Francis's two predecessors, Benedict XVI and John Paul II, would come under this condemnation as doctors of the law. But the Remnant is not an ideological newspaper. I know from previous editorials and articles, some of which I've written, that the Remnant welcomes an alliance among all Catholics of traditionalist orientation, and even those in the Novus Ordo environment, who in many respects are more traditional than a lot of traditionalists. I mean, in the Society of St. Pius X, you might find at the level of private conversations, not in the publications or the official stances, but privately among individuals, problems with Americanism, problems with hyper-capitalism, jingoism, getting on board with the latest war, that kind of thing on the part of individuals. And yet, among some Novus Ordo parishioners who are of conservative orientation, you will find that they are absolutely traditional, except for the fact that they attend a new Mass, perhaps because they have no other choice. So it isn't a simple question of we are the traditionalists, or the society is traditionalism. It's the society, it's the Fraternity of St. Peter, it's the good Catholics in the Novus Ordo environment who who accept what has been offered to them because nothing else is available. And many of them, by the way, put a lot of traditionalists to shame. We're looking for an alliance with all Catholics of goodwill who stand up for the traditions of the faith, who are now being condemned as doctors of the law by the Pope.
Yeah. One of the ways that I've been using sort of an analogy, I'm saying that, for example, St. Edmund Campion and his friends, Elizabethan England in the 16th century, I'm sure there were some that were saying, he's a coward, they're cowards, they're changing their names. He used the name Mr. Edmunds and posed as a jeweler so that he wouldn't get arrested, so that he could continue to go on serving the Catholics and offering the papist Latin Mass for them. Didn't want to die on hills he didn't have to die on. So I see a similarity between that. I mean, Campion probably, some would have said he should be on Traitor's Gate condemning Elizabeth and condemning Cranmer and shouting giant statements and so forth. He didn't. They kept their silence to some extent and quietly went about serving the flock of the Lord. And I think there's a case to be made for priests who are either diocesan priests or priests in the Fraternity of St. Peter who need to keep their heads down a little bit. But that doesn't mean they're not undermining the revolution. That doesn't mean they're supporting the new Mass or supporting Vatican II or anything else. And if we can just get those constructive conversations going, I think all of us can be much more encouraged when we go to bed tonight, thinking, yes, there are a lot more people out there who are ready to stand up, like in the book of Esther, we're told that we must do, step up, stand up, and stop being silent. Speak out. Especially when you're aware that there are a lot more of us, and by us I mean faithful Catholics over a lot of these different dividing lines that are ready to step in and fight back.
Well,
and as you say, take our religion back.
I agree, and I think that a blog like Father Z's blog has more throw weight than the Remnant for that reason. He's not perceived as a traditionalist. He's just a good Catholic priest who is becoming rapidly fed up with what's going on. We need more and more people like that. I just had a conversation not too long ago with a very prominent lay Catholic whose apostolate is world renowned, and he's thinking about becoming more expressly traditionalist. And I said, there's no need for that. You just be a Nicodemus friend of the movement, keep preaching sound doctrine the way you're doing it. You don't need to join the traditionalist polemic. Some of us are involved in that, others are not. What matters is that we're standing up for the integrity of the faith, and that we're opposing this demagogic campaign on different fronts to convert Catholics into Pharisees. It's the most unbelievable thing I've ever witnessed in covering this beat of church affairs as a journalist for the Remnant and elsewhere. And all of us have to unite, the Father Z's, the Fraternity of St. Peter, the Society of St. Pius X,
Christ the King.
all these different blog sites, whether or not they're traditionalists. That's how we're going to stop this steamroller from crushing all of us.
Chris, years ago, a friend of mine, a good priest, who will remain nameless for the moment, but you know him, many people know him, but he said something interesting to me about the Remnant. He said, keep doing what you're doing with the Remnant. Keep the fire up. He said, you know what? You're not going to hear me publicly support you, but privately, I need you to keep going. We're going to keep on praying for you and pushing you to continue to do that. He's talking to laymen, Chris. I'm not saying aren't we courageous, and he's not. He's talking to a layman that is under no vows of obedience or anything else. We have the ability, we have the opportunity to speak out. So I guess that's what I'm saying. I'm not talking about false, ecumenism now in the traditionalist world. I'm talking about taking people kind of where they are. And those of us who have the ability or the right or the opportunity to speak out loudly must do so. Those priests who are not able to do so, Chris, we can't ask them to place their heads on chopping blocks in order to prove their trad cred to us. We have to understand what it means to be saying exclusively the Latin Mass, what it means to be using the old catechism of Baltimore catechisms and so forth to teach your children. They are undermining the revolution in their own quiet way, and we need to wake up and appreciate that fact, right?
Well, we don't need anti-Vatican II polemics from the pulpit on Sunday from priests. I mean, a lot of lay commentators, Roberto de Mattei, Romano Amerio, and Iota Unum, there's vast scholarship on the part of educated lay people conducting that polemic. And there are some priest theologians who do it, but not all of them have to do it. The main order of business is to maintain the doctrines of the faith in a parish setting at the level of the individual in a parish. And this insane campaign to throw that all aside so that divorced and remarried people can come marching in and receive Holy Communion as if mortal sin no longer exists, that's a threat that all of us have to be concerned about.
Yeah.
And the way that priests who are not in the traditionalist movement or don't want to be perceived as being explicitly part of the traditionalist movement can address the problem is just to preach sound doctrine from the pulpit. And without even mentioning Francis, they can just insist on the church's traditional discipline. I mean, the bishops of Poland just came out with a statement, basically without reference to Francis, but obviously directed to him, in which they say that it is essential to maintain the church's traditional discipline with respect to the admission of divorced and remarried people to Holy Communion. And it's no coincidence that the Polish bishops are from the country from which John Paul II hailed. So the Pope's home country has taken up a position against this insane Casper agenda. Now the bishops of Africa have done the same thing. Cardinal Sarah says that I solemnly affirm the Church of Africa will under no circumstances tolerate a rebellion against the teaching of Christ, in reference to this teaching on the indissolubility of marriage and attempts to undermine it in practice. And these are not traditionalist voices, but they're absolutely essential to what has to be done now. There has to be a massive resistance movement to what can only be described as the insanity that is going on now at the highest levels in the church, which is being fueled on a daily basis by, I'm sorry to have to use this word, these bizarre sermons at Casa Santa Marta.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. And, you know, Cardinal Burke recently said we have to be prepared to suffer persecution, even martyrdom, in defense of marriage. So he's sending these messages loud and clear that we're up for a big fight coming up here in October. And, you know, I'm sorry, Chris, I don't mean to be cynical, but this Year of Mercy thing, I mean, isn't that's just another excuse for us to get pounded away from on high about what we need to do is stop resisting, stop getting in people's faces, and just go along with everything, because what's coming is going to be a real, I think, a change in the church's teaching on some of these very important moral issues. Year of Mercy? Yeah, right.
Well, I mean, the Year of Mercy belongs in the same bin as the Synod on the Family. All of these things that have been conducted in the name of this or that, which actually achieve precisely the opposite of the expressed objective. The Synod on the Family degenerated into an attack on the family. The Year of Mercy is going to make a mockery of the notion of mercy. There's going to be mercy for adulterers who are living in a state of public adultery. There's going to be mercy for the gays. There's going to be mercy for all manner of sinners, but no mercy for Orthodox Catholics. And certainly no mercy whatsoever. Bring on the doctors of the law when it comes to the Society of St. Pius X. So this Year of Mercy is just another bit of camouflage for the same program of auto-demolition that is now in fifth gear under this pontificate.
Yeah. No, that's it. It's very distressing. And like you said earlier, if our voices are rising up a little bit and we sound agitated, that's because, guess what? We are. I mean, this is ridiculous. This is completely out of hand now. And I tell you, there are a lot of people who are agitated and who are upset and furious because, as you said earlier, they want our religion back. And I think, just end on that note, that's exactly a great way of putting it. Give us our religion back.
That's it, in a nutshell. And that's what we should be saying, shouting from the rooftops, using all of the means available to us. And if the Holy Father or somebody close to him is watching this broadcast or comments like this one, perhaps it will have an impact. I mean, we can be populists too, but let's be populists and say, we want our religion back.
Exactly. Well said, my friend. We'll talk to you next week, and thanks so much for chatting today.
Thank you, Mike. God bless you.
All right, we'll see you. So for Christopher Ferrara, I am Michael Matt, coming to you from the Archdiocese of St. Paul and Minneapolis. Thank you so much for listening. By the way, we are having a lot of discussions, good discussions going on over at remnantnewspaper.com, so please drop in several times a day if you want to help us out. I think Remnant TV has been going for, a couple years now, Walt? Got a couple of years, and I don't think we ever have asked for any help on that. But if you want to help us out, we certainly could use some help. And there's a little tab that says Stop Christophobia on the homepage of remnantnewspaper.com. Please click on Stop Christophobia. Maybe we'll put that on the screen here. And please help us out in any way you can. It would be greatly appreciated, and we'll continue to do our best to give you something in the way of fighting back against the Christophobia that's become so rampant. So again, thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next week.